I was 20 years old and 5 days away from realizing the dream I had harbored for as long as I can remember. I'd always wanted to travel to Europe and paint. And it was a Friday morning. I decided to go to the eye doctor for a last-minute checkup. And when I arrived, everything seemed normal. And they started looking at my eyes, and he became worried. So my doctor brought in a couple other eye doctors. They took turns examining my eyes. And then he took a picture of my retinas. And we could see the tears forming along the bottom and the hole on the right. And he told me that my retinas were detaching, and I was going to need surgery. At the time, my mind was already in France, so I had asked to have the surgery when I came back. And he kind of looked at me. He said, "Claire, there's no way in hell you're going to France now. You're going to be blind in a week if we don't do surgery on your eyes." According to my doctor, this was in every sense a medical emergency. So that following Monday, I underwent intensive eye surgery. I remember coming home and just collapsing into my mother's arms. She was taking me inside the house. I had bandages over my eyes, and I was exhausted from the surgery. I didn't know if I was ever going to see again. And a couple of days later, I was allowed to take the bandages off, and I remember seeing blurs of reds and greens and whites, and I was excited because that meant the surgery had worked, and maybe there's still a chance I could go to France to paint. So 2 weeks later, my doctors released me to fly, and at that moment, I decided, I booked a flight, packed a suitcase, and flew to France anyway, because I realized then I was no longer a student listening to a teacher, that this was my life, and I had to make these decisions on my own, and I might not be able to ever to do this again. So I went, and when I arrived in this beautiful city, this small town nestled in the French Alps, I was partially blind, virtually no understanding of the French language. This was the first time I'd ever traveled by myself, let alone lived by myself. But I remember arriving and thinking how beautiful everything looked and how bright the colors were. And realizing at that moment, I wasn't afraid, because in the beauty of this amazing place, I knew that this is where I was supposed to be. And I wanted to document all of my experiences here, and it wasn't enough to take a photograph. I had to paint. And so I started painting, and I couldn't stop painting the water. It was this brilliant Caribbean blue, and the mountains, whether it was in the morning or the evening or in the wintertime to the springtime, they never reflected the same color twice. So at times there were shades of deep violets and pinks and reds. Other times there were greens or shades of gray. And my painting served as my journal entries as I was regaining my sight. So they started off pretty blurry and dark, and then as I gained my confidence and my sight back, they became a little brighter and a little bit more complex and a little bit more colorful. And about halfway through my internship, I had to start applying for scholarships so I could afford to go to college the next year. So the next challenge presented itself in the form of a dress. I submitted a couple sketches to a major fashion magazine. The objective was to design a wedding dress, so I submitted my sketches, and a couple of days later was notified I had made the semifinals and had about 4 weeks to make this dress. So I started cutting up my bed sheets in my room to figure out how to construct this dress on my body. Then I got enough fabric, and I started hand sewing this dress on myself because I didn't have a sewing machine and I didn't have a body form. And I mainly spent my time in the evenings after I got home from work and in the middle of the night to sew this dress, because I had to rely on my reflection in the windows because I didn't have a mirror large enough to see how the dress looked. And at the end, I was able to get the help of some of my friends to model the dress for me. And in about 4 weeks and just under 300 hours, I had finally created something more than a painting, something tangible. My dress. And shortly after I was notified I had made the final rounds, my internship had ended at that point. I flew home to Ohio, and a couple of days later was flown directly to New York, where myself and the 4 other finalists presented our dresses on a runway show in Times Square and on Good Morning America, where they made the final announcement of the winner. And although I didn't win, it was that moment I was standing on stage, and I realized my internal triumphs meant more to me than any public accolade, because the entire time I was making this dress, I was doing this for myself to see if I could create something again. And as the competition ended, I flew home. I saw my friends and family again, and it wasn't until the fall. I was driving down the street in Cincinnati with my friend. I remember seeing the leaves changing colors and seeing the color red again and thinking how vibrant it looked. And at that moment, I realized I was the same girl from Ohio, the one with a simple dream to travel to Europe and paint, the one who had taken her sight for granted and had fought to get it back. And when I was around my friends again, I started seeing them have their own goals and take their own risks. And I realized that taking a risk is contagious. And when one person takes it, it becomes easier for others to realize their own. For me, I was driven by my love affair with color and light and art, and I wanted it even more when it was taken away from me. And I achieved it because I took a risk. So my question for you is, if tomorrow were your last day, what risk would you take today, and would you take it? Thank you.